So on the subject of food, what we just heard Lutzen read to us is actually referred to as a sandwich. So it's a narrative device where you have two stories read together or written down together, where one starts, then the other one is in the middle, and then the first one ends. So the story of the healing of the woman, older woman, is sandwiched within the story of healing the 12-year-old girl. Now, these stories, this pair of stories in this sandwich appears in every gospel other than John. And notice how here we actually don't have the reference to the 12 years. So the details differ between these three accounts, but the story, the pair of them, in fact, is undoubtedly the same. So when I reflect on it today, I will be pulling details from different accounts, because in my mind it is the reference to the same pair of stories. And in fact, even these two stories, to me, is actually almost like one story. They, in my imagination, fit within the one chronological sequence. And I imagine it as beginning, well, perhaps 12 years or so before Jesus' public ministry began. We are told in one of the accounts that these women lived in Capernaum, so the northwest shore of Lake Galilee, and there must have been two young women there who came of age and were ready to get married and did get married. One of them married a man called Jairus. So again, here in Matthew's account, he's anonymous, but other accounts tell us that he is Jairus. And he is a prominent man in Capernaum because he's the leader of the worshiping community. So the woman who married him came into the family of status, possibly greater wealth than others in the town, and they were eventually also blessed with a child, whom I will here call Talitha. Again, it's an Aramaic word that means little girl, and Jesus uses that term or that form of addressing her in one of the accounts, though not here. So this little girl then grows for 12 years until we arrive in this situation here that's represented through this sandwich of two miracles. The parallel story to that is of the other woman who would, in my imagination, is close to age to Talitha's mother. So when Talitha's mom marries Jairus, we have this other woman perhaps also marry, and I will call her here Veronica. The reason I will do that is because there is a Christian tradition that identifies this anonymous, woman who's not named in any of these gospel accounts, who touched Jesus' cloak to be made well from her condition, which was chronic bleeding, with the woman who, when Jesus is on his way to the cross, during his last hours of his life, he pauses for a moment, and that woman touches him with a cloth. So here, this woman touches his cloak, his cloth that he's wearing, and in that moment, non-biblical, but traditionally recognized part of the journey of the cross, the woman called Veronica wipes Jesus' face with a cloth. The cloth becomes a relic. It's kind of tangled. Which cloth, where is it kept, and what image does it have? A shroud, a veil. But the point is, the Christian tradition identifies the woman who wiped Jesus' face before the cross with the woman whom Jesus heals earlier, a few years earlier, from chronic bleeding by her touching his garment. And her name is Veronica in the Christian tradition. So there you go. You have two women. One became a mother to Talitha, this girl who was flourishing and growing until one day she wasn't. She contracted some grave disease that in some Gospels endangered her life. But in Matthew's Gospel here, by the time her father comes to Jesus to beg for a miracle, she's already dead. And so the other woman, though, Veronica, when the first woman had Talitha, she might have also hoped for children, but we are told that she's been suffering for these same 12 years from chronic bleeding. And fact of life that sometimes we forget if we don't spend much time thinking of how female bodies work is that if you have any kind of a chronic bleeding, it makes it nearly impossible to conceive a child. It either signifies that you just don't ovulate or do so irregularly, or that your body environment is not hospitable to a baby developing, so you might suffer a series of miscarriages. So chronic bleeding is never a good thing, and it's particularly devastating in terms of the consequences for having children, but it also results in extreme tiredness, anemia, and in the case of this woman, again, something we don't readily appreciate today, also social isolation. Because in the Jewish tradition, which in fact the Orthodox Jews still observe now, you cannot have intimate contact with a woman who is bleeding. So if you bleed more often than every 12 days, because that's the length of time prescribed by the Jewish customs for staying apart, you then miss the window to try for a child entirely. And in today's Judaism, that tradition still holds for the relationship in the home, so between the husband and wife. But the accidental contact, like if you just bump into a woman who is bleeding, is no longer problematic. But in the days of Veronica, it was a problem, because it also meant that even if you accidentally touch somebody in a crowd, or touch somebody's garment, for example, somebody's cloak, you make that person unable to enter the temple, where you needed to enter periodically to offer sacrifices. Now the temple is destroyed. The Jewish tradition today focuses on the synagogue, not on sacrificial offerings. So the concept of ritual purity is no longer applicable, and this accidental touching and being in the crowd is not penalized. But in Veronica's case, making her way through the crowd, touching Jesus' garment, would have been a courageous act. And the way she led her life was likely also increasingly isolated from her family, who would have refrained from touching her, and it could have led to any number of consequences, from perhaps even divorce, which then would almost necessarily entail poverty, to this barrenness, to not being able to have children, which had both the implications of status, a lack thereof, or also the limitations on vocation, on fulfillment that many humans derive from caring for others. So in fact, the story of Veronica comes full circle, because a woman who was not able to conceive and care for her own child effectively, finally, is able to mother another, and that is Jesus, who at that time needed care. So here she needs care, and she reaches out to receive it from him. At the end, several years later, at the end of Jesus' life, she effectively mothers him, and the one who needed care is able to give, and the one who gives care is able to receive, which I suspect is why this beautiful legend has been preserved for centuries, extra-biblically, just through tradition and legends. But it's a picture of discipleship. It's a picture of our vocation and our living into the fullness of the image of God. The ones who need care are empowered to give it. And the ones who are all-powerful, like this God, really, could she have rendered Jesus unclean? Could you make God ritually impure? That's the irony of the story. Of course not, but the one who has this power to heal in his human body represents that vulnerability, that openness to receive others' care that we too embody in ourselves. That's how we're human and divine, because we care for others and we depend on others as well. So that is the background for this pair of miracles that are told together always in the three Gospels because they complete each other. The meaning of one is inseparable from another. And it's at this mark where the two families meet Jesus, where their trajectory of the two families kind of converge. The woman who was unable to give life to a child, and in the process over these 12 years, kind of also lost her life, met Jesus, right at the same time as the other family who gave life to this child, who was growing in it into the fullness of near adulthood, was now at the point where they lost all hope, where the child lost her life in this account, or in others was close to it. I wonder what a 12-year-old goes through in that moment. Some families in the parish know, but would a child wonder what they've done wrong? Would a parent wonder what they could have done differently at that point? And so this Jairus, the father, of course he runs to Jesus. At least the little girl has somebody to intercede for her. Unlike Veronica, who had to stealthily make her way through the crowd, hoping just to touch Jesus' garment. And so this father, the head of the household, the head of the synagogue, the prominent man, has to ask for help. Again, that image of reversal of power. But can you also imagine, as one who is probably used to telling people what to do and getting his ideas implemented, here he has to wait. There's an interruption. This woman, she takes Jesus' time. Jesus is on her way to help the kid. And here, every second that he engages in a conversation with this woman who was nowhere nearly of the same status as Jairus' family, who was practically, possibly an outcast for reasons I explained, she has taken Jesus' attention and time and possibly taken away the chance from the little girl to get better in time. An interesting experience we all have had in our lives when we all put our needs above those of others and were frustrated. But Jairus waits because Jesus makes him wait, because Jesus refuses to hurry past this woman. And the result is that, as it says in another gospel, she told him the whole truth. That's a phrase in Mark, I think, that Jesus already knows she's been made well. So the miracle already happened. She's already healed. Then why does he need to pause and engage in this conversation? I would say it's for the same reason as he says to the parents of the 12-year-old, give her something to eat, which, if you notice, again, is not in the Matthew's Gospel we read today, but it's in another account. And it's because the nourishing, the symbolism of being truly and fully alive is, in the girl's case, in being fed, being taken care of now by her parents, not by Jesus, because they sort of take over this role. And here, in the woman's case, she is not made well, fully well, until somebody truly sees her, hears her story, hears the whole truth, and dignifies her and brings her back into the community, not just by removing her physical condition, but by allowing her to experience the real connection in which somebody finally heard the whole truth. And the whole truth was that Veronica really stands for many, many women who were seeking answers for their chronic health and psychiatric conditions, and were not given them by the physicians and psychiatrists for pretty much since Veronica's times and before. I have read more than one book on the subject, and I highly recommend one that's called Unwell Women. And that is a book that surveys the history of medicine for the past 2,000 years or so, and argues that women's conditions are not treated the same way as those of man, because medicine invariably interprets physical ailments through the cultural lens. So in Veronica's time, in antiquity and in her era, women's bodies were seen as those of deficient man. So they were treated like man's bodies who were lacking in important ways. But at the same time, every ailment you experienced was somehow tied to the reproductive system. So there was this idea that one's uterus could somehow wander through the body and arrive in various places in your body and cause any number of issues from psychiatric to physical ones. Interestingly, in Veronica's case, her condition actually was related to this organ, which still did not mean that anybody had any treatment for her or an answer for her condition. And that time frame of suffering for 12 years is, in fact, not an exaggeration in the Bible. That concept of uterus ending in weird places in your body is actually a strange echo of what medicine discovered only hundreds of years later. It's a condition called endometriosis, in which endometrial cells grow in areas of in organs where they're not supposed to. And that does cause infertility and chronic pain and bleeding. And it's a condition that's notoriously difficult to diagnose. So people today wait for diagnosis for about 10 to 14 years, which is spot on with Veronica's timeline. And why is this the case? It's because of various cultural assumptions which physicians, often male, until very recently, brought to interactions with their patients. So it's a fascinating history. I recommend Unwell Women. This is a book surveying medicine. And then there is also a body of literature that surveys psychiatric treatment for women, beginning with the book called No Such Thing as Normal, which is very enlightening. And the point of it all, or the central thesis that you get through such recent writings, is that primarily women had to spend a lot longer than men in interactions with physicians to convince physicians of that they were having pain. that their testimony or their account of their symptoms was not as likely to be believed as that of man, that it was often reduced to the reproductive system, even though there was no appropriate treatment for the true gynecological conditions. Their pain was often normalized. Their research with specifically women's conditions was often underfunded or at times unethical. And so all of this stands in contrast to, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder that men returning from war began to experience in the last century. Well, they've always experienced, but at that time it gained particular attention and was firmly identified with something that happened to the man, the stress they endured in the trenches. But the women's condition, psychiatric and physiological, were consistently linked to something within them. Something wrong with them, either not male enough or trying to be too much like a man, or too sensitive, or hormones then eventually became like an explanation for everything. But regardless, all these explanations were found within women, minimized and sometimes attributed to a bewildering range of what a uterus might do as it traveled through your body. Now, modern advances, of course, have been great, and now a lot of physicians are women, if not in some specialties, maybe the majority. Still, we deal with the legacy of poor funding, poor representation in research, unethical trials of drugs tested on some populations but made unavailable to others, such as middle-class women not having access to contraception when Puerto Rican, in the olden days, Puerto Rican poor women served as subjects for trials without adequate consent. We live with this history. We have made great advances, but the time to diagnosis is still often these 12 years. And what Jesus does here is quite distinct from the system today and in any era before, in that I think this is the point of the story. He allows the woman to truly tell him the whole truth. And the healing we don't always get ourselves with our any number of psychiatric, psychological conditions that take time to diagnose. And perhaps the diagnosis itself is not always helpful or the point. But the point is to be seen. The point is to be cared for. Why? Because that in turn enables us to care for others and to see others as fully human. So like Veronica, who was able to touch Jesus and connect with him, was then able to care for God's incarnation in a human body himself. And Jesus does call Veronica his daughter in one of the accounts. I don't think in any kind of a paternalistic way, but to draw the parallel to being restored in the family of God. The 12-year-old was restored to her family. Veronica was restored to her ability to live in community, to be no longer on the margins, to no longer making anybody unclean by interacting with her. So, can we make this miracle happen in our lives? How can we connect or touch somebody in our immediate circles today that will draw them more fully into the life of our communities? Maybe that's where the true miracle happens, the one that is possible in our lives in light of the physical limitations with which we live. So this coming week, let's look around. Let's see whom we can raise to new life or feed or connect with or truly see. Thanks be to God.